Hi, welcome back. It's been, again, months. Sorry about that, but I just had to come on here and make this video in response to Jess Owens's video about read better books. So before you watch this video, I highly encourage you to go over to her channel, watch her video. I will link it for you. But she's talking about a TikTok creator who is an educator, and she's talking about how both young children and adults don't seem to be reading critically anymore. It's all kind of candy, brain candy, fluff. Nobody's reading critical books. Nobody's reading books that are challenging them and making them think about things in a critical way. And so the point of that video is Jess was kind of analyzing what this teacher was saying and, is this really trying to just create a discussion? So I started to respond to that video, and instead I ended up writing like 3 pages, and I'm like, okay, this is a script. I just need to make my own video response. So that's what we're doing. Now, the educator was not saying specifically that people need to be reading classic literature, hard books. Got a hair somewhere. Oh, okay. But just better books. And she's not saying you shouldn't read just fluff or whatever makes you happy, just books that you can just relax with. But what she was saying was that you should be reading also things that challenge you, things that make you think, make you analyze. And people have thoughts. So I'm in a weird position on this topic because my personal reading tastes, as many of you know, are primarily classic literature. From a very young age, I was drawn to the classics, and it's definitely continued into adulthood. Most of the books that I talk about on my channel is this preferred genre. But I think there's a specific reason for that, and I feel like it ties into the overall discussion about how to get people to read better books. So when I was in 3rd or 4th grade, we had this exercise time slot for the kids where the entire elementary school had to go out onto the soccer field, and teachers included, principal, everybody, for like half an hour or something, and we had to walk around for, that time period. Now, maybe it was less than that, but like at my age at that point, it felt like forever. So I remember, though, that I read a book to read while walking around the course, and it was Moby Dick. Now, granted, it was an age-friendly version of Moby Dick, because like I said, this is 3rd grade, 4th grade. Then in 5th grade, I was reading Shakespeare, and again, an age-friendly novella version of the plays. Okay, well, to be fair, it was actually both, because I was actually in like an advanced kind of class where we actually did end up performing Shakespeare. We performed A Midsummer Night's Dream, and that advanced program that I was in studied the Elizabethan era and the works of Shakespeare. So by high school, I was reading the actual plays of Shakespeare as part of the curriculum, and I was even going to see 2 of Shakespeare's plays performed. Woo, Canada. So my perspective is, because I was able to find accessible classic literature at a very young age, those age-friendly versions of the classics helped give me a baseline understanding of the story in an enjoyable way, so that as I got older, I was then able to read from that original source material without struggling to understand it. I could more easily analyze it from a critical lens because of that. Now, I'm still not great at seeing underlying themes and symbolism, and, well, this is really commentary on that, but I do love those types of discussions, and I seek them out. It's why I follow the booktube creators that I do, because I learn so much from them, and I love the discussions that their reading and analyzing starts. But if I hadn't been exposed to those age range versions, I don't know that I would have had anywhere near the same experience in my entire reading career. I think that was a big starting point for me. And I think if the goal is to have not only a literate society, which should be the bare minimum, right? But a society that enjoys the classics and these harder works, then we need to change how we approach them. So, throwing Shakespeare at a 14-year-old freshman in high school for the very first time and expecting them to understand it at all, even surface level, is kind of ridiculous, right? Expecting them to be able to analyze it too? Absolutely preposterous, I say. But give a kid a story at their skill level that introduces them to a cool world and cool characters in a way that they can explore when they get older, then I think you've increased your chances of them being prepared to read tough literature and hopefully enjoy it at least a little bit. Also, while in high school, if Shakespeare is going to be part of the curriculum, I really feel like you should also then be going to see the plays or the films about it. Because let's be honest, Shakespeare was meant to be seen and not read. Plays are meant to be seen and not read. It makes way more sense when you can watch the play or the movie, and the language barrier then gets a lot easier because the language of Shakespeare, when you hear it over time, even from, act 1 to act 2, you start to pick up on a lot easier than when you're just reading it. It doesn't always make sense if this is your first exposure to it. For this harder curriculum, we have to meet people where they are. And for kids, teenagers are definitely still kids. That means they're not going to understand these deep classics naturally. And because of that, they probably won't enjoy them at all. And if we keep trying to force dusty, dry classics down their throats and then demand that they spit back out thoughtful analysis of obscured symbolism, we're setting them up to hate reading in general and to avoid hard literature in the future. Okay, and now I think we need to talk about the term literature. It is definitely a real thing. Some people make the argument that literature is any printed work. It is not. Two books can have the same word count, and one is literature and the other is not. However, that doesn't place value on either of them being termed literature or not. To me, it's like saying one book is horror and one is romance. That doesn't innately define them as more or less valuable than each other. It's just a way to categorize them. I definitely don't feel that literature is a genre, but I feel more like it's a category or a sub-label. There's horror literature, see Frankenstein, and there's horror non-literature, which I don't have a good example of because I absolutely hate reading scary stuff, but I'm sure you can think of something. So I can't give a precise definition of what I feel like literature, the term, means, but it has to include something deeper than just a good story. In literature, there's a message in it. There's social commentary, there's criticisms within the work. Whether it's obvious or below the surface, it's in there. Now, most books do have this element to some degree, but I think the difference is intent. Literature, in my opinion, is designed to be commentary, wrapped in a story to make it palatable. Whereas things that are not considered literature are works that are stories primarily, and in that story they may include commentary. Oh my God. I think a really good example of this is Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist. Dickens was appalled by child labor in his day, and so he wrote Oliver Twist to bring this condition to the forefront of society's consciousness and hopefully conscience. He created the story to talk about the issues. I'm going to read this directly from Britannica.com. Charles Dickens was well versed in the poverty of London, as he himself was a child worker after his father was sent to debtor's prison. His appreciation for the hardships endured by the impoverished citizens stayed with him for the rest of his life and was evident in his journalistic writings and novels. Dickens began writing Oliver Twist after the adoption of the Poor Law of 1814, which halted government payments to the able-bodied poor unless they entered workhouses. Thus, Oliver Twist became a vehicle for social criticism aimed directly at the problem of poverty in 19th century London. So that's the big point. It's the intent of it. And I think the point of literature, as far as the original TikTok creator that Jess is talking about, I think that's her point as well. I haven't seen the whole TikTok video, but based on Jess's description of it, I really think that that creator is trying to say that at some point, kids should be exposed to works that make them think about the world around them in a critical way. And a lot of times that introduction to critical thinking starts with literature. The story is easy-ish to understand, and then you teach them to dig deeper, and then you teach them to apply those insights into their own life and conversations about larger issues. If we're not teaching kids to do that with literature, then how are we teaching them to do it? Are we teaching them to do it? And I'm by no means saying that literature is the only way to teach kids the skill of critical thinking, but it's a good way to do it. And frankly, as far as I'm aware, it's the most common way that we've done it historically, or at least tried to. Where I believe we're losing the plot is how we're approaching this in schools. And this is from the American education lens. I'm sorry, the rest of the world. Either a school is giving Shakespeare or George Orwell to middle schoolers and high schoolers and saying, okay, start finding the symbolism and write a 5-page paper about their social commentary. Or we're skipping these hard books entirely and just passing kids through the grades to move them along regardless of their abilities. Both approaches aren't really there to teach kids. They're there to meet grade quotas. That's not to say that teachers are not trying their best to teach. But I just don't think the American school system is designed to create well-rounded critical thinkers. I think they're leaving that up to the colleges to do that work, unfortunately. But what about the kids who never go to college? There are surveys that show how people grouped by education levels vote for certain parties or policies, and it's really interesting when you look at that data. You can take similar race and age groups and find that their interpretation of current events is very different, and that difference between them is usually determined by their education level. I don't think that's a coincidence. When you assume that college is the place that will teach kids to think critically, then by default you're saying that those who don't go to college are going to interpret the world completely differently than their college peers. And as far as reading non-literature and the argument of, well, look, if that's all they're willing to read, then at least they're reading. It's a little too late at that point, in my opinion. If you've never taught someone how to read and enjoy and analyze literature, then you're likely not going to get them to start once they're an adult. And if you do that wrong from a young age, you may turn people off to books completely. Like everything, obviously there needs to be balance. I think the American education system could use an overhaul completely, but for now we'll just focus on the English curriculum. For any non-Americans watching, English in American schools means reading and writing. It's the read this, analyze it, write a report class. The way I see it, kids should be reading in kindergarten. They should know their alphabet and be able to read books made for their age group, usually 6 to 7 years old. If they're learning to read in kindergarten, fine. But by the end of kindergarten, they should be able to read at least rudimentarily. This puts some of the onus on parents to be teaching kids this before they get to kindergarten. Grades 1 through 5 should be building up those reading skills each year, and it should be done by finding books that these kids want to read. Kids should be given access to a range of books and then also assigned reading book X in whatever week, month, whatever the curriculum is. So they should have access to things they want and then things that they do have to read as part of the curriculum. It doesn't matter what the books are, just that they should have to read something at an assigned time. But get their love of reading going, little by little, and by letting them figure out what they like to read. If you do group readings, then let the kids choose these books as a group. The more involved they are in making the choices of the books they're reading, the more invested they'll be in actually doing that reading. And then in these ranges, 1st grade through 5th grade, find kid-friendly versions of classics. They exist. They're out there. I read them. They don't all have to be this type of kid-friendly classic book, but start to introduce them here and there. Then 6th through 8th grade, which is about middle school, start assigning harder and yet still age-appropriate versions of literature, classics, and begin working with kids on the themes and commentaries in these books. Also, assign independent reading so they can pick what they want and continue to enjoy the process of reading because they're in control. You don't want to stifle the appetite for reading in general, but you can start to put more expectations on some critical reading skills here. Finally, 9th through 12th grade or high school. Assign them the actual literature, actual classics. Find modern classics to include along with the older classics. Let them see how their world experiences are actually reflected in these books, some of which these themes and commentaries have been going on for centuries. And include movies or plays of these works. Let them experience these stories in different formats. And while you're assigning these readings to them, give them also the time and the assignment to read for pleasure. Let them pick their own books here and there that they still have to read and either discuss, or small papers or samples of their analysis of these books, but the ones that they've chosen. These ones can just be anything. They don't have to have literary value as far as the English course is concerned, but just keep them reading. Something I've also been thinking about is I wonder about how they could introduce audiobooks into the classroom. Some kids really struggle with reading because of dyslexia or other learning conditions, and maybe listening to books would be easier for them. That should also be encouraged. I don't think that it's necessary for a kid to read with their eyes to say that they've read a book or that they're able to analyze it and write about it. Granted, it may be harder for them to reference things and go back, to look stuff up for a paper, but we should be giving kids this accessibility so that they're not struggling if reading is a struggle. I feel like this program, if it was done more this way, would be preparing kids so much better for the college experience of being required to read a lot and to read really hard books. We can't keep pushing kids along to the next grade without teaching them anything, especially about teaching them how to learn. So many times, schools focus on memorization. They're not teaching concepts, but also they're not teaching how to learn. They don't encourage curiosity. They don't show them how to explore their curiosity to find their own answers. They really need to teach kids how to learn, and different kids learn in different ways. That needs to be figured out. I also do think that this problem bleeds into things like media literacy. Lacking critical thinking skills and lacking a healthy dose of skepticism leaves people unprepared for the bombardment of brain rot and misinformation and disinformation. It also doesn't teach them how to interpret actual information into their real life effects. Rather than thinking something through from start to finish, they just let other people think for them. Oh, well, if you do this, then this is what you'll see. But that may not really be the case. Sadly, we've basically just trained the last couple generations to simply believe what's said to them, whether that's influencers, teachers, parents, community members. We're not teaching them to think for themselves. Not every kid grows up to just swallow whatever they're given, but enough do. So yes, in the end, basically, I do agree a lot with that TikToker about we need to be better about teaching kids, and it really can and should be through the medium of literature. But that shouldn't just mean classic lit, and definitely not in the same way we've always done it. There are so many other aspects that people have talked about. Jess even made a second follow-up video, which I also watched and enjoyed, where she brought out a lot of the community responses to her first video, and people talk about the fact that you can teach critical thinking skills without reading, without literature, and I definitely agree. But I do think, one, it's one of the easiest ways to teach it. Two, it's kind of already built into our school system. We're just failing at executing it. And three, I do think it's one of the most effective ways to do it, because in consuming reading, in consuming books and literature, it bleeds into so many other areas like media literacy. Getting your news from TikTok or YouTube or the newspaper, whether that be in print or online. I haven't even seen an in-print newspaper for a while, but I used to love flipping through the newspaper, the physical item. I didn't necessarily like reading all the articles, but I found the crossword in the comics. But basically, I just think that this is a really great way to teach this. It's a great opportunity. It can help build and foster love of reading through kids. But if by the time we're adults, the only thing we want to consume is just books with no real substance, I think we're missing out on a lot. And that's not to say that those books don't have value and aren't worth reading, because they absolutely can be. Just reading for the fun of it is so much more valuable than doom scrolling on your phone. But in that should be harder things that challenge us and that make us think and make us think critically. Characters and stories help define us and help mold us into the people we want to be, because we see characters that we want to emulate in certain ways. And we can take little bits and make that into our personality. You can get so much more out of that from reading than you can from other mediums, in my opinion. So, with that disclaimer, this is all my opinion, but I did want to respond to Jess's video, and I did promise her in one of her live streams that I was actually going to get around to doing this. So here I am. I just finished doing some auditions and getting some of my voiceover work going, but I thought, what a perfect time to just get this video out here. So thank you so much for watching. I would love to hear your comments about this. Do you think people are reading too much garbage? Do you think that classic literature should be something that we force down kids' throats in schools? And if so, how? Do you enjoy reading classic literature? And if so, why? What do you get out of it? What do you think about the idea that if we don't read harder books, we're doing ourselves as a society a disservice? I would love to hear your thoughts down below. So please leave a comment. Give me a thumbs up if you liked this video. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. And as always, I'll see you in my next one.